us. I'll talk more about the winds coming up in just a few moments, but first, here's Krissy with traffic.
Well, the holiday gift for commuters is the lighter volume out on the roads. We are still seeing some pockets of patchy fog, though. As for the drive on the QEW, both Toronto and Niagara bound to Don Mills, no major delays, just starting to see a little bit more volume popping up there. But for more on the active weather story, over to you, Emily. Thanks, Emily. And speaking of getting into the spirit, I just checked in. Santa is in the South Pacific, so it's coming. But things moving on the roads. Let's head to the roads from the skies. Again, we'll dive more into that coming up with more traffic. But first, the wind story with Emily. Thanks, Emily. And you mentioned the fog, and that's really the only factor that could slow you down a little bit this morning, reduce the speed as there are some dense patches out there. But overall, as you can see on the traffic map, things in the green zone. 401 coming up. But first, more on our active weather story with you, Emily. Yes, Emily, and I know a lot of people are going to be traveling today to various gatherings. An OPPR warning if you're heading in through the Orono area, some heavy, dense fog patches there. Even on my own drive, as I traveled from the QEW to the 403, that's where I really did encounter those heavier patches. But first, for more on those howling winds on the way, over to you, Emily. Thanks, Emily. Well, GO Transit, a couple minor delays. TTC, no major disruptions. I will have more details on the drive coming up, but first with the wind story, Emily. Thanks, Emily. And dense fog patch is a concern. OPP tweeting out that very heavy fog in Flamborough as well as Orono. And really, on some of those major routes, I have been seeing the fog out on the cameras on those eastbound travels. So more details on that drive coming up. But first, more on the potential of damaging winds with Emily. Well, the big thing we're seeing out on the roads is not so much the volume, but the fog. Still some very dense fog patches. But again, you may encounter a couple pockets where it is quite heavy. The big problem that's going to arrive by the evening, though, is the wind. Thanks for that, Emily. Now, the major concern on the drive this morning is the fog. We've had some very dense fog patches, OPP warning motorists about those conditions. The good news, though, as you'll notice from the traffic map, is that things are green. But at least that is the silver lining for those of you that may not be off for the holidays. Thanks, Emily. And it's the fog that's making for some hazardous conditions for the drive. Now, luckily, things are lightly traveled. You can see on the traffic map everything in that green zone. Coming up, okay, take a look on how things are heading into downtown. But first, with the wind story, over to you, Emily. Thanks, Emily. Well, the big weather story in the drive has been the fog, quite dangerous and hazardous through some areas there. Now, I'm really starting to wonder, Emily, if Santa plans on getting me a new fence for the holidays. I lost a chunk of mine in the last windstorm, so what are we in for?
Well, you know, I could check in with him. He's in Russia right now. We're tracking him, and he's in Russia right now. So I'll send him an email. We'll see. Right. More on your wind in just a moment, but first, here's Krissy with traffic.
Thanks, Emily. And the big story for the drive, of course, has been the fog. We're still seeing some fog patches out there, but overall, when do you see the traffic map look like this? The conditions, of course, as we head through the evening commute, it will be holding on to the steering wheel that will be the main problem out there. Thanks, Emily. Well, for the morning drive, I mean, when does the traffic map look like this with green all throughout, everything moving at a good pace and quite lightly traveled? The big issue that we've seen out there today has been the fog. Now, seeing those foggy conditions improve in some areas, which is good news. But if you are traveling out later in the day, well, Emily, I know we are in for some very windy conditions. Thanks, Emily. And I'm glad you mentioned the fog because that's really been the story for the drive. Of course, things a lot lighter because it is the holidays, so less commuters out there. All about those wind gusts, as Emily, as I understand, they could be damaging. Thanks, Emily. And you mentioned the fog. It certainly has been really the biggest concern on the drive because overall things have been really lightly traveled through. So patchy fog, the concern. Later, the concern, of course, is going to be the winds. And for that story, over to Emily. Thanks, Emily. Well, the big story on the drive, of course, has been the fog. But luckily, as you can see from the traffic map, it has been in the green zone. If you're heading out for the holidays this evening, do not drink and drive. Want to bring that point home and to bring down the point of the howling winds. So I'll send it over to you, Emily.
Thank you, Krissy. Yeah, the winds are certainly going to be the big story, and they're really going to start to pick up in intensity later on this evening and through the overnight.